moving on to how pharma is completely reforming their plans integrating digital health. It's really exciting for this next session because you'll be able to hear, I guarantee, well, I'll be able to hear at least, some really cool things. So I want to introduce you to Rick Valencia, who's going to be leading this next session. He's the Senior Vice President and General Manager at Qualcomm Life. And his New Year's resolution was to lose the 10 pounds that he knew he was going to put on by attending mHealth, CES and Digital Health Summit, JP Morgan, World Congress. So we'll catch up with him next year and see how that went. Let's welcome them to the stage. Thank you.
Yeah, it's, I thought it would be 10 pounds that I would be putting on over that period of time, but it's already exceeded that, so I got to get to work. I'm Rick Valencia with Qualcomm Life. This is Corinne Savill. And Corinne is with Novartis, and she heads up their business development and licensing organization. And we are digital on this side and health on that side, right here. And I'm curious about the audience and sort of the mix here. I'm a technology guy by background. And I know there's a number of people here that come from healthcare. But by a show of hands, so we know who our audience is, how many of you consider yourself digital? Okay, it's a good number of them. And how many health? All right, it's about 50-50, good. How many consider yourselves digital health? Ah, that's what I like to see. Very good. All right, well, we're really lucky to have Corinne here because we have one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world that is thinking about what the next step is in drug development and basically just how their business model is evolving. And we talk about it in our little world here, our digital health world, and us techies talk about it a lot, but it's great to hear directly from a big pharmaceutical company about what they're thinking and how they're progressing in this area. We've been working with Novartis and other pharmaceutical companies now for a good 3 years, and we've watched quite an evolution within Novartis, within other companies, about how they're approaching this and how they're forming up the teams that are attacking this and how they're moving from the innovation teams into teams that actually have charters and budgets and commitments to start delivering on some of these solutions. But like I say, it's really going to be fun to hear directly from Corinne exactly how they're thinking about doing this and what the broader goal is. What are they trying to accomplish by leveraging digital technology? So I hope I didn't set expectations too high for you, because this group I know really is excited to hear from you. But so we've heard a lot about pharma going beyond the pill. I've heard a lot of discussion even in the previous panel. What exactly does that mean at Novartis? When you think of that, when you guys talk about it internally, and I'm sure you do, right? Yeah, that term comes up. What is it, and what are the key drivers behind it? Why are you thinking about that?
So, I mean, traditionally, pharmaceutical companies got, or our business model was basically to make pills. So to make little white pills, or maybe blue pills or pink pills if we were innovative, and sell them in bottles at pharmacies. After the doctors prescribe the pill, then the patient receives them. Now, increasingly, that is changing. And it's changing I think, for a number of reasons. One very big reason is, I mean, again, the pharmaceutical business is a funny business. You know, companies make pills, patients take pills. We, in quotes, sell our pills to doctors who prescribe pills, but the people who pay the pills haven't been mentioned, pay for them haven't been mentioned so far. So those are, and it depends which country, so we're here in the US. So in the US, then it's either, your insurance fund, indirectly your employer, or the government through Medicare or Medicaid. Those people pay increasingly, they're getting more sophisticated and saying, you know, it's not good enough for us to pay you, Novartis or any other pharma company, simply because you have this pill that you've shown in a clinical trial does some good to patients. We will only pay you if you can actually demonstrate a positive benefit, so a positive outcome to the patient. So if the patient has, for example, asthma and is breathless, we will only pay you if you can show that that patient has been able to breathe better for a period of time because they're taking your medicine, and that you can prove that. And we'll only pay you if you can prove that these patients no longer get worse, i.e. they don't exacerbate and need to go back to the ER. Then we'll pay you even more because you're saving money for the overall system. So that is one of the main drivers for companies like Novartis to say we have to go beyond selling pills and actually to selling outcomes, selling positive health benefit outcomes to patients. And to do that, we need to change the way we measure outcomes as well.
Wow, think about that. That is a dramatic change. What, so with that underway now, what is actually happening in the business from drug development through commercialization? How are you even reorganizing? I mean, what are the steps that you're taking internally to get there?
Okay, so I mean, it breaks down into a number of categories. If I stick for now on outcomes. So how do you actually measure outcomes? Well, again, kind of using the traditional model, then what companies did, like Novartis, was and we still do, because we still have to, and I think we will have to for a long period of time, is you run a clinical trial. So a clinical study where you take patients with the disease and you give them your new potential drug therapy, and you compare them with patients who don't have that drug. Either they have some other standard of care for the disease that they have, or they have just placebo, i.e. nothing. And you run a whole series of studies. This can go on 7, 8 years, where you're actually testing whether your drug works in patients. It's usually done in big medical centers, so big teaching hospitals. There's a lot of infrastructure around it, and you're measuring lab values, you're measuring blood values. The physician may be measuring other clinical values on the patient. And it means that the patients have to, if they're not hospitalized, they have to leave their home, they have to go to the center, they have to be measured, and it takes a long period of time. And then the payers will turn around at the end of all that, which can cost billions and take, as I said, 7 to 10 years, and say, well, you've only proved that your drug works in a highly controlled setting. You've only proved it on still a high number. It can be thousands, but still compared to the number of patients that have the disease, a small number of patients. And you've only proved it over a limited period of time. It can be even 6 months or a year, but it's still, compared to the lifetime of chronic diseases, which can go on 10s or 20 years, a relatively short period of time. So they said, thank you very much. It's great data. It's very interesting. But actually, you haven't shown it works in quotes, the real world. And that is when patients are at home, when they maybe forget to take their pill as regularly as they could have done, where maybe they don't do all the other things that the physician was asking them to do in the hospital to make sure that they were, taking the best overall treatment for their disease. So increasingly, we need to be able to measure outcomes in a way that can be measured at the patient's home and in a way that can carry on being measured after they've left this controlled setting. Mm-hmm. And that's basically where, if you like, digital technology and a capturing of remote data can play a big role. And that's probably, I'd say, one of the biggest changes.
So theoretically, the trial could be continuing on beyond the trial.
Yeah.
That data can still be coming back, clearly.
Yes, and we have to do that. In fact, in a way, we've always done that. So we've always continued to run trials, sort of what we call phase 4 trials, or studies that are done after the drug is launched. Mm-hmm. But increasingly, we want these studies to be studies that actually involve... We said I had to be loud, but that wasn't me.
Is that a sign?
Okay. the studies have to be studies that involve the patient more and have what we call patient-reported outcomes.
Yeah.
So the patient themselves is reporting, I feel better, this morning I could walk X many meters, which I couldn't walk before, or this morning I woke up, I was not as breathless as I was in previous days. So that's what we need to capture from the patient. And also we'd like to be able to capture more things where it's actually, blood values on the patient and to be able to do those remotely. And that's some of the other work that we're doing.
Great. And what is the hoped for impact of this for Novartis, and what is the expected impact and hopefully benefit for the patient?
So if I take for the patient first, I mean, one of the hopeful impacts for patients is that we make our therapies much more relevant for them so that we get the right drug to the right patient. Because many diseases that today we call one disease, like, for example, let me think, cardiovascular disease, chronic heart failure, that can have a number of different causes and a number of different variants, if you like, of the same disease. And not all drugs will work to the same extent in all patients, even though they're all termed of having chronic heart failure. So by measuring the outcomes precisely on individual patients, we hope to be able to better tailor our therapies to be able to work in those patients and therefore give the patients a better treatment and a better quality of life. And also to be able to measure things on the patient. So one of the first signs that your heart disease is getting worse is that your heart stops working as efficiently, and you actually accumulate more fluid in your tissues, more fluid in your lungs, which is actually what it makes you breathless, more difficult to breathe. Now we know at the moment we have the technology whereby we can measure that. So we can measure on an individual when actually they become, basically their tissues fill up with fluid. If we can measure that, then actually, and we can monitor it on a real-time basis, then we can also alert their physician, or their physician can be alerted that they need to intervene, that they need to increase their therapy, for instance, or maybe that they need to remind them that they shouldn't eat as much salty things in their diet. And by doing this, we hope to vastly improve, the ability of the drugs to work, but also the patients to be able to control their own disease. And then for companies like Novartis, it's vitally important for us to be able, as I said before, to demonstrate these positive outcomes, to be able to have a strong and sustainable business moving forward, because increasingly that's what insurance companies and that's what governments around the world are looking for, and rightly so.
Right. And today, pharmaceutical companies don't have direct relationships with patients. They don't capture data directly from patients. In fact, legally in some cases you can't. And so the way you describe it sounds as if you will in the future. It's not, but so why don't I let you explain that? Because
okay.
I know there's a nuance there.
Yeah, no, we would not be able to capture data on individual named patients that we identified. So we have now already, if you like, services set up for patients. So one of our biggest drugs is a drug called Gilenya for the treatment of multiple sclerosis. And we have a whole big infrastructure, which is for multiple sclerosis patients to enable them to access that drug and also to give them advice on treatment. But that's all done through a third party. So although Novartis may support it, it's actually an independent third party company that would be able to do that. And all data that would come back eventually to the company would only come with the patient's permission, and it would be on a totally anonymized basis. So we would not know, the individual patient to whom the data came from. What we would be able to do would be to look across all the patients that are treated and hopefully be able to combine that with other measurements that would enable us to understand better how the drug was working, and therefore be able to develop more beneficial treatments in the future.
Great. And so on the topic of patient engagement is a big topic right now. We're all learning as we're developing our products, launching our products, that it's actually a lot easier to get a contract signed with a big company that has a great plan. And it's not that hard to get it deployed and ready to scale. The big problem is that going from there to scale, getting patients engaged and wanting to use the solution, want to take the drug and stick to it. And so I presume patient engagement is also a big challenge on this front. And what can you share with us about that?
Yeah, so working closely with patients is something that is very important for us and something that we put a lot of emphasis on. We want to maximize the ability of patients to give input into how we do our research, into the drugs that we develop, and then into how they're actually brought to the market and how they're actually used. We use a number of methods to do this. But you're right, increasingly social media has become very important and very active. So there are many different patient societies and patient groups. And these groups are very active. They've got very active presences on social media. And they can be great sources, actually, of information and information for companies like Novartis. We also set up our own sites. So, for example, one of our biggest drugs is a drug called Lucentis, which we commercialized together with Genentech in the US. And that's for the treatment of wet AMD, which is a progressive form of eye disease whereby eventually, if untreated, you will lose your sight. So we've got a social media site which is called Set Your Sights. That's actually one of the most hit and the most common sites for people with the disease. And on this platform, it allows patients to talk about their disease, talk about the drug, talk about what they find good about it, what they find bad about it, and we can adapt the ways in which we make our drug available, or we can work on other things, for example, how you measure sight, and remote ways of actually measuring patient sight is something that we're looking at, because at the moment the patients have to go back to the doctor, to the clinic, and have a very complicated test called an OCT test, and depending where you live, which country you're in, that may or may not be available, and you may have to wait for a long period of time. So one of the things we dearly like to do is to actually make that all able to be done remotely, so it's no longer a backlog in the system, if you like, getting your sight tests.
Excellent. Non-adherence, another big issue, a big lost revenue opportunity for pharma, but also a big cost to the system, close to $300 billion for otherwise avoidable medical conditions or medical treatment. So, and that's just in the US. So what role do you think connected technologies will play in helping to drive better adherence? And what's the expectation?
Yeah, so non-adherence, I think, is a very is a more complicated topic than you think it is at first light, because there are many reasons why patients, or us, because we'll all be patients, why patients don't take their drugs. Sometimes it can be because they forget, but that's probably the less important reason. Often the reasons are, for example, I'm an immunologist, I used to work in the area of transplant. So when people have kidney failure, and in the end their kidneys no longer function, and they need a new kidney, and they have a transplantation, and they have a new kidney, or even worse, they have heart failure, and they need a new heart, and they're lucky enough to get a transplant. Now, even after they've been transplanted, they have to take drugs for life to control their immune system. And even in these patients, you have a non-adherence rate to therapy, which can be as high as 30 to 40%.
That's amazing. Life or death.
Yes. So you would think that, especially if, for example, the kidney came from a loved one, that you might be more adherent to the therapy that allows the kidney to function, but not necessarily. And when you I'm not a psychologist, but when you start to look at it, there are a lot of reasons why people don't take their drugs. One reason can be side effects. So in that particular case, the side effects of the drug aren't pleasant. One of the drugs can make you hairy. And if you're a young girl or even an older girl, you don't want a hairy face and you don't want chubby cheeks. So they don't take their drugs. They kind of forget. So there's a lot in non-adherence. It's not just the reminders, it's also motivation.
Sure.
And I think as well, monitoring. So if you're actually monitored whether you take it, and somebody knows whether you're taking it or not, that can also play a role. And we've got to be careful because people are kind of free individuals, and if they're children, they don't necessarily want you to, adolescents, let's say, tell your parents that they're not taking the drug. So it's a whole complicated area. But I think there are a number of things that can be done.
Yes, I heard a stat, and I can't source it for you. I don't know exactly where it came from, but so don't quote me on this. But that teenage girls are more compliant on the pill than patients who've just gotten a transplant and have a life or death. Take your drugs, or you may die. That's amazing. So you also oversee the venture investments there at Novartis, and I know you've been making investments in this space for several years now. So tell us about some of the things that are interesting to you that play in this realm.
Okay, so we do a variety of different things at Novartis. To stick on adherence, then a few years ago we developed a relationship with a company called Proteus. So some of you may have heard it. This is the chip on the pill company, where you actually put a chip on the pill. You can tell
we all know Proteus, right?
Patients have taken the pill.
Yeah.
We're still working with Proteus and exploring avenues for ways in which we can find useful utilities for that technology. Other things that we've done, so we work at the moment with a tradition, well, I can't call them traditional, with a venture capital company, with a healthcare venture capital company called MPM Capital, based out of Boston and San Francisco. And through them, we've made investments and developed relationships with a number of small companies. So one company would be called Trinetics, and what they're doing is working on a more digital solution for how we identify patients for clinical studies. So one of the biggest challenges for pharmaceutical companies like Novartis is to identify suitable patients on which to conduct our clinical trials. You'd think it would be easy and simple and quick, but it's not. It can take time, and it's very expensive. And we can approach it in two ways. One way, actually, is a social media way that I told you about already, because if patients are informed about studies, then they actually look for sites that are recruiting them. And another way we can do it is actually by having a system whereby increasingly our health records are electronic. So if you've been to see your primary care physician, or you've been to a hospital, you've got perhaps a serious disease, then your health record is electronic and is on a database. But all hospitals at the moment have their own individual databases. They don't talk to each other, and they're not connected. What we are working with this company to develop is a system that can sit on top of all these independent databases and search them in a totally anonymized way. So the data is still totally anonymized, but we can then identify in different health centers around the world where exactly the right patients are with precisely the right characteristics to go into our clinical studies. This should enable us to be able to develop drugs more efficiently, to bring them to patients more rapidly, to be able to treat them more quickly, and also to make sure, as I said in the beginning, that we get the right patients who can benefit most from our therapies in the clinical studies early. So that's one of the things they're doing. We're working with another company working to actually make as I mentioned, the patient-reported outcomes, so the electronic patient records, in a much more easy way for patients to be able to deal with, so they can enter the data themselves, wherever they are, whatever they're doing, in a very friendly way. We've invested in a very small company, which has we call it the leech, but it's a little system that basically is a very small device that you can put on your arm, just press it, and it can take a very small amount of blood. And this blood it can take in a sterile way, which can then be tested. So at the moment, if you want to do a blood test, you have to go in to see your physician or to see a nurse, and the blood has to be taken, then you have to go back home. So we're hoping that we can get this technology to work such that the patients will be able to take their own blood, maybe even in the future be able to actually test it in their own homes, and the results go into a central system. So these are the types of things that we're doing.
Very cool. One last thing, and then we will wrap up here. So do you want me to wrap up now? No, okay.
So we're good.
So they were talking at the tail end of the last one about wearables and talking about patches. And drug device combinations, patches, injectables, inhalers, even pill boxes. So today, the primary focus seems to be around adherence also there and measurement of dosage. But do you see a day, and if you do, how far out, where these body-worn patches, not wearables, invisibles, things that you're not showing, and the drug combination will be taking a look at the biometrics, understanding probably from patient-generated data the context in which they're in at the moment, and sort of closing the loop with that information, and maybe even delivering the drug through the patch.
Okay. I think certainly, and I don't think it's too far off, the actual collection of biometric information. So the ability to collect all sorts of different biometric information, as I mentioned, for example, in heart failure, is something that I think is just around the corner. To be able then to deliver the drug independently of the patient kind of taking a pill or injecting something, that requires you to be able to formulate the drug in a way that it'll actually pass through the skin, or will be actually in some sort of depot inside the skin. And that's a little bit at the moment of a rate limiting step. So we can do that with certain molecules, but not with all molecules.
And I should have been more general. What I really meant was with that information, closing the loop by identifying the exact dosage, whether it's in the injector, in a patch, or even in a pill box.
Yeah. I think theoretically you're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the way clinical trials are conducted and the way dosing information is worked out today, it's kind of relatively crude.
Yeah.
You know, you run a study and you run it at, I don't know, 30 mg per kg or 60 mg per kg, and the patient takes, okay, we show in our clinical study that 60 mg per kg worked best and was safe, and therefore all patients take that dose. Now, in reality, it'll be a kind of normal distribution of what dose you need, and some patients will be smaller than others, and some patients will be larger than others. But unless there's a very, very big change, the physicians don't adjust the dose. Whereas probably if you could better measure the effect of the drug, and better able to dose titrate it, but again, then you'd have to think how you're going to do it, because at the moment you have kind of one pill or maybe two pills.
Right.
But theoretically, that is something that could be done.
Very good.
The regulators would also have to change how they want people to conduct clinical trials as well.
Well, thank you very much, Corinne. I know the crowd really appreciates your perspective, and thank you all for coming.
Really fascinating. Thank you so much.